Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. As usual, I'm your host, Jacob Shapiro. Rob Larity is back at it with me this week. I almost felt like we were a little bit rusty. Rob and I have not been able to get together for our weekly chat here in a couple of weeks due to scheduling and vacations and sickness. Rob is a trooper. He showed up for this one, even though he's not feeling 100%. An absolutely insane week. We start off talking about the Fed and U.S. economic policy and how that interacts with each other. We get to the explodey stuff with Hezbollah and Lebanon around minute 21 in the podcast, and then close with some thoughts about Mexico's judicial reforms. If anything here piques your interest, you can email me directly at jacob@cognitive.investments. Otherwise, take care of the people that you love. Don't buy beepers that are made in Hungary, licensed by Taiwanese companies. Cheers and see you out there. Rob, somehow I seem to have been able to transmit my sinus infection to you because I hear in your voice that you're going to win the Grammy Award between us, and maybe the Israelis and the Mossad can tell us something about how you transmit diseases through microphones. It's good to be with you.
That's a chilling thought.
Oh, I have a lot of chilling thoughts coming in this podcast. Get ready for them. But we both have young kids, and I just wanted to. This is our third time trying to record this intro, listeners, because we had some technical difficulties at the beginning. But I did want to say that I was talking about a friend who told me that she was never sicker than when she had young children, as wonderful as raising young children was. And then I also mentioned that we had a podcast listener who felt so bad for me the last time that I was on here. Apparently, I sounded so terrible that he reached out and said, you should just think of this as your immune system getting exercise. Like your immune system is getting stronger with every subsequent thing that it fights off. And I haven't replied to him yet, so I'll reply here. That's great, but I'm effing tired, man. I don't want any more exercise. I'm good. It doesn't seem like the immune system's getting any better either. It just keeps on coming. So anyway, we have a lot to talk about today, Rob. We've got the Fed cutting interest rates. We've got Israel doing all sorts of weird World War III stuff. We've got BIOSECURE Acts and China overcapacity and Mexico judicial reform. We'll see if we'll get through everything. To just get our feet wet, though, this is not the most important thing happening this week, but the Fed did cut 50 bips, and we've been ahead of the curve, if you will forgive the pun, on talking about the Fed, on interest rates in general. So before we get into a lot of the crazy, explicitly geopolitical stuff going on, I wanted to give you a chance to cook on interest rates and what you make of it, because we've been talking about rates higher for longer and inflation higher for longer. And the Fed apparently, they didn't unveil a mission accomplished banner, but sort of feels that way, doesn't it?
It does feel that way. And I think it's more interesting than one might think. They did cut by 50 basis points. And just to update listeners who may have been following our commentary over the months as we've kind of talked about this, there's a few different themes that we've talked about with relation to inflations and with relation to monetary policy. And I think it's worth reminding them. And one of them is volatility. So, economic volatility, volatility of policy making. Um, if you want to think about volatility in the political cycle, we just had the second, attempted assassination of a political candidate. So, the thesis that we're in a volatility spiral where volatility begets more volatility, I think is pretty well supported if you look at all these factors. And that's one of the key takeaways that I have from the press conference is um, he was given the opportunity to declare victory. And you'll know I really like Jay Powell. I think he has the hardest job in the world, and I admire him quite a bit. I think he's a really, solid person for that role. But I think the mistake that he is making, even though he's not declaring victory, is he's sort of framing this, and I don't see how he has any option, but he's framing it as almost a linear system. And what I mean by that is he's saying, well, now we're in the sweet spot because growth is pretty good and inflation has come down, and we're not going to declare victory because we're still vigilant and all that stuff. But now we can kind of let it ride for a while. And I think the error that that makes is in assuming that this is a stable system, that after oscillating hugely down and hugely up in the last few years, that all of a sudden you're just going to find a nice Goldilocks balance. And I think if you look at some of the underlying factors going on in terms of, underlying price pressures, some of the weakness that we're seeing emerge in non-residential construction, which is really rolling over after having a huge boom. Um, I think probably the economy is more dynamic than that, and that in the end we're going to say, "Oh man, he made the classic mistake of being not forward-looking enough." And I don't want to rag on him because I don't think he has a choice. As I said, all he can do, and the thing that he repeats, is we can only look at the data. We can only look at the data. He cannot anticipate. It's not his mandate to say, well, I have a pretty good hunch that things are going to slow down pretty dramatically, so we're going to get well in front of it. You just can't do that in a bureaucratic institution like that. But I think it's important to put that context around what's happening, and that would be the differentiated view that I have and we have from most other commentators who are like, "Oh, it's 50," and like, who cares? Like, you're rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic to some extent, and that's not to use um, an Armageddon metaphor, but the important thing is what's happening at the bigger level here, and sort of, is the economy accelerating or decelerating, and how violent are those lurches in each direction? And our bet would be that they're going to be more violent in either direction than one thinks.
Well, so if you could unburden Jay Powell of his bureaucratic shackles and give him the mandate that would allow him to be more forward-looking, um, what would you see? What would you be advising him to do if he did have more agency?
That's an impossible question because I don't think he has the tools to accomplish what we want him to do. Interest rates are an extremely blunt tool. And as you can see, so much of what's been happening in the economy and with inflation and prices is about fiscal policy. It's about supply side constraints. If a bunch of Houthis shoot missiles at a tanker in the Red Sea, that's kind of outside of Jay Powell's remit, unfortunately. Um, and that sort of stuff has come to be somewhat paramount. And I think, using that same metaphor as I always do, like the ship in the bathtub, and the water's churning up and down, and the ship's going up and down and up and down. Like, it just takes time for that to work its way out of the system. And I think the only improvement that he could possibly make would be to try to fade the moves a little bit more than his mandate would currently allow him to do. But even then, it's really hard because as we're seeing this economic slowdown, there's evidence. We've talked about inflation expectations. Inflation expectations on the 5 to 10 year horizon, which is what do people think is going to happen long term, basically, they're still at the top of their range. And we've talked about this in the past. Listeners might recall that's the median response, which they report in that University of Michigan data point. If you look at the average response for 5 to 10 year inflation, it's absolutely spiked through the roof. It's at 6.2%. So some contingent of wackos who respond to this survey are saying, "Oh my God, I expect inflation to be 10%, year over year." And that would be fine if the survey was always like that and there was always a huge gap between the average and the median, but there hasn't been. That's a very new phenomenon. So,
Mhm.
um, yeah, it's not a job that I would want to do, and I feel for him. I'm not sure there's much better that he could do.
Yeah, before we leave this, I'm going to move up this in the conversation because I think it dovetails with what you're talking about. Because, at least from my point of view, one of the big problems for the Fed is that also U.S. government policy and the Fed are working somewhat at cross purposes. So the Biden administration, it had the big Inflation Reduction Act, quote unquote. It blew out stimulus at the beginning of the Biden administration. But really, what the focus of the Biden administration has been for the last couple of years is on industrial policy and on workers and on really protecting American industries. They've taken down none of the Trump tariffs. They've added more tariffs. They've been more surgical. They're being more protectionist in general, even if they're doing it with less bombacity. And it doesn't seem to me that all of those things work in tandem. I was listening to Adam Tooze on Odd Lots yesterday when going for a walk, and he was talking about the emphasis on the industrial economy, on the manufacturing workers, versus the lack of emphasis on services, which is where the majority of the American economy and where growth is actually going to come from. But the United States has gotten itself into this weird pickle where it's not really focusing on services, and services are under pressure, whether it's because of labor or um, wages and things like that. You've got this policy to protect manufacturing industries that just can't compete with China for the most part. There's no way you're going to snap your fingers and you're going to do these things. And then you have a Fed that is tasked with, well, but we need to keep inflation low while keeping growth going. And it's impossible to keep inflation low if you're engaging in trade wars with your top trade partner, China, and with a bunch of other countries on the periphery. And even saying, Nippon Steel from Japan, an ally, can't come in and buy a U.S. steel company. So that's a way to tee you up maybe for the BIOSECURE Act, because I think a lot of people, and we've talked about semiconductors and the CHIPS Act and the commanding heights of semiconductors being a focus of the Biden administration going forward. Early returns on that, not great. I mean, Intel is what is in something of a death spiral of itself. It seems to be lashing out in every direction to try and maintain its existence, let alone its relevance. But I thought some of your comments on our internal platform on the BIOSECURE Act were extremely important, and I wanted to give you a chance to talk about those in the context of what we're talking about here too, because that, in some ways, that's the biggest problem I think with U.S. policy. The Fed can do whatever it wants, but if it's dealing with U.S. government whose policy doesn't fit with the instruments and the objectives that the Fed has, like what are they doing?
Yeah, so this is a very it's a very nuanced and interesting topic. And let me preface this by saying I would go so far as to say the BIOSECURE Act is interesting because it's imagine if we had done the CHIPS Act 20 years ago or something similar. I think that's what I'm going to ultimately get at here. So let me just because most listeners probably won't be familiar with what this is or what's going on because it has gotten virtually no attention, especially relative to how important it is. So the BIOSECURE Act, essentially, it's already passed the House. It's going to the Senate. It's expected to pass before the end of this year, and it passed with, I think, a three-quarters majority in the House. I mean, there's bipartisan support. This is going to happen. And what it does is it says um, it's sort of a combination of CHIPS Act and the sanctions on Huawei because the BIOSECURE Act is intended to do two things. It's intended to protect Americans' genetic information, which sounds futuristic and creepy, but it's true, from manipulation by a foreign actor, in other words, China. And it seeks to secure the supply chain for U.S. Production of medicines. Now, that's really important because there's two different types of um, production for drugs. And again, this is very similar to semiconductors. If you think of it like the high node semiconductors, fabrication, which is less complicated, it's more commoditized, and then you have the low node, like the TSMC super high end stuff. It's very complicated. You're getting into the realm of physics, that sort of thing. In terms of the edge of innovation, that's how one should sort of think about this as well, because you have molecules. Most drugs are molecules. I mean, that's pretty straightforward, which is pretty straightforward in terms of manufacture. It's sort of like a chemical manufacturing process. I mean, it's literally what it is. You're making molecules, and they have to be standardized and safe. But it's something that we know how to do, and that sort of thing is done all over. So, India, for example, has a lot of capacity to make molecular drugs because it's lower on the value chain. The higher end stuff, and this is where it gets more interesting, is the manufacture of biologics. And this is where, and just to caveat this, I'm no expert in this area. I'm a generalist who's been diving into it because it touches on a lot of areas where we have investments and interest. So, with that caveat, the issue with biologics is they are like the high complexity, innovative edge part of the business. And these are biotech drugs. You're making proteins, you're making very complicated biological cell based medicines, CAR T cell therapies, that sort of thing. And essentially, that's where the long term growth is going to predominantly be within the biotech industry. because these are the really more complicated drugs, the more value add, where a lot of the R&D intensity is happening. So uh, that's the background on how these things are made. So what about China and the US? So the background to this is traditionally a lot of pharmaceutical companies made their own stuff. And just like semiconductors, if you rewind the clock, it used to be that most semiconductor companies would make their own chips. And then you had the outsourcing trend where they would focus on the fabless design. And then they would outsource to fabs and companies specialized in the fabs. And you had, TSMC emerge as the giant there. So the sort of industry dynamic of biologics manufacturing and drug manufacturing today is sort of like semiconductors like 25 years ago, because there's an emerging TSMC like figure, which is Wuxi, the Chinese company, which is not only cheaper, according to if you read transcripts and interviews with industry people who work at pharmaceuticals and biotechs, not only are they cheaper, but they're also better, which is just terrifying for all of their competitors. And they're better in an area that at the high end of the innovation curve is extremely difficult to do, much like TSMC. And it's very dependent on what is your error rate, what is your yield on the number of, units, if you want to call them that you're producing. So the analogy is very close. So Wuxi, you have to picture as the TSMC emerging player, and they've been just absolutely kicking everyone's ass for the last 7 or 8 years. So as of 2019, they had only 5% global market share. Within 2 years, they were at 10%. And if you were to see a more recent number, it's upwards of 25%. And that's of the total market. If you look at just the really complicated manufacturing, there's basically three players that I can see. There's Wuxi, there's a company called Lonza in Switzerland, and then there's a company called Catalent, which was acquired by Novo Nordisk. And this is an interesting side plot to this story because there's also others as well, but those are the three really big ones. Charles River Labs, they do this, that sort of thing. But those are the three really big players. Novo Nordisk acquired Catalent because they wanted to make sure that they had access to their own dedicated manufacturing capacity because they're growing so much because of the GLP-1s that we talked about. Um, so you have one of the three giants that's going in-house and getting vertically integrated. Picture this like Intel making their own chips. Um, no one's going to use Intel as a foundry because they don't want to, have a competitor manufacturing their chips. So now you have a significant portion of the total industry capacity that is sort of questionable, and people will think twice about going to Catalent. So anyway, um, I'm getting too far into the bottom up part of the story, but this is really essential to understand because there's so many echoes to what semiconductors were like. And what has happened with this BIOSECURE Act is the US has basically come out and said anyone who works with these companies, and among which there was Wuxi, BGI Genomics, which is essentially the Illumina of China, and two others, uh, will no longer be applicable for federal, supported research grants and all, basically put the clamp on all of the
Hmm.
developed world pharmaceutical companies. And this is a really fascinating issue. There was an 8-year grandfather period. So they said, you have 8 years to figure this out. Existing projects you have with these companies, because these are multiple year. Not only do they do the manufacturing, but most of these companies, including Wuxi, have sort of a contract research element where they'll run the clinical trial. They'll do other sort of more R&D supportive roles. So there's all these tentacles between pharmaceuticals and these companies. So there's an 8-year grandfather period, but for the most part, all of the major pharmaceutical companies in the U.S. and Europe can no longer work with Wuxi, um, to sign new contracts as of once this comes into force. And this is relevant in part because it is like semiconductors 20 years ago. And the key questions I think, and I don't have all the answers to this, it's sort of speculation, but it's worthy questions to ask is the US going to do anything to replicate this capacity? And can they do it? Number one, because you've already seen the industry narrow into a few capable hands, and one of which just got bought by one of their customers. And the other one is a Swedish or is a Swiss company, right? So there's some question marks around that. Um, and then the other one is what advantage does this give Chinese biotech companies? Because if you look at the numbers, the Chinese biotech community is still very small, but it's growing in leaps and bounds. And to have access to a domestic champion who's basically been cut off from servicing, a lot of the foreign market, and by all accounts, they're about 20 to 30% cheaper than the equivalent services provided by Lonza, never mind Catalent, which was the considered the expensive one, and they're better than everyone else. It's like if you had Huawei to build everything for you, and you had a startup community 25 years ago, and Huawei then got cut off from the US and said, okay, we're gonna we're gonna just focus on the markets where we still have access. What would happen? And that's the question that I think is so relevant and interesting here.
And again, cuts back to the Fed and inflation and really about the future of progress in some ways. Um, you're right. It's sort of a double metaphor. You're talking about, what if you're talking about TSMC scenario? So what if China had TSMC, but it does for biotech, and then at the same time, what if you do to Huawei? If you apply those policies to something like this biologics company that you're talking about, what does that do for China's biotech sector? Does it set back biotech in general in the world? Does it increase the costs of drugs? Everybody's talking about demographics and we're getting older and the drugs that we're going to use to combat everything from age to obesity to new diseases. And I don't know if you've been scanning, Rob. It feels like every other week now we've got some new disease that's popping up around the world that I have to learn about and think about in terms of the next apocalypse. So important things there. Let's leave that and let's go to the fireworks for the week. Rob, I wanted to start. Well, let's give a little bit of background. So, unless you've been living under a rock, you know that Israel carried out just an absolutely brilliant intelligence operation against Hezbollah in Lebanon. It was, I believe, on Tuesday, a bunch of pagers, beepers. All of you Gen Zers might not even know what a beeper is. I remember very well having to page my dad if something went wrong at school, and then he would call the school number back. Like, it was a very interesting 10 years where everybody had beepers. It was this green, clear case. I remember it very vividly. Anyway, so Hezbollah is still using beepers because they thought it was safer, a good way to communicate in case things went down with Israel. And Israel somehow implanted explosives in thousands of beepers that Hezbollah was using and was able to trigger them to all blow up at the same time. How this happened is still an open question. Some of the reports, and we'll get into this a little bit because I really do think this is important. Um, the beepers themselves are designed by a Taiwanese company. They licensed their beepers to be produced, or at least they claim that they licensed their beepers to be produced in Hungary by a company there that has less than 1 million in revenue annually. And at least what the reports are saying, Hezbollah bought beepers through a European shell company that was actually owned by the Israelis, and somehow the Israelis got explosive material in the supply chain into these beepers before they got to Hezbollah. I have so many questions there that we can go into. How did they know that they were going to get to Hezbollah? Who is the Hezbollah beeper orderer guy? Like, is there a job within the Hezbollah Department of Communications that I'm going to go buy beepers? Was it a Hungarian company? Did they have to intercept a shipment? Did they have to like take a shipment off of a ship somewhere and put in the explosive material, put it back without anybody knowing? Like, I have so many questions. Um, and I mean, hundreds dead, thousands injured all across Lebanon. No way it's just Hezbollah fighters. It's going to be children. It's going to be civilians. Imagine a child picks up a beeper that's beeping randomly. And I mean, I'm sure that has happened. I don't trust the data on either side. The Israelis are saying, no, nobody was hurt. And, Lebanese and Hezbollah authorities are saying, oh, no, like half of these people were civilians and children. Doesn't really matter. I'm sure a percentage of them were. Um, the next day, Wednesday, walkie-talkies, reports of solar panels, computers, all other sorts of things. And I have no fracking clue there, because at least with the beepers, okay, there's a company that makes them, there's a supply chain, there's this shady thing happening in Budapest. Like, we can start to speculate. There's some reporting about it. Everybody, or at least most of the media, has been like, oh, well, a bunch of other stuff is blowing up. And again, hundreds more dead, thousands more injured, things blowing up at the funerals for the people who died the previous day. Then last night, so we're recording on Thursday, this will come out tomorrow morning, Israel started bombing southern Lebanon in mass. And you've got the Israeli defense minister, who is also, he's ironically rumored to be on the chopping block, going to get fired by Netanyahu. But he's also saying there's a new phase in the war, and that Israel is redeploying significant military assets that were in Gaza to the northern border, and that Israel is not going to stop until the Israelis who have had to flee their homes in the north because of the ongoing rocket fire from Hezbollah can go back to their homes. They're talking about a total change of the security situation. And while the Israeli government has not admitted that they had a role in any of these things, that have strange things that have happened in the past week, they obviously did have a role in those things. And you can, if you're thinking of it as a warm up to an Israeli incursion or an Israeli invasion, I mean, that makes some degree of sense here. Israel's not pulling out of Gaza, by the way. It's going to continue to turn Gaza into a humanitarian disaster and parking lot. Like, that's not going away. They still have hostages to get back and everything else. So Israel is, by its own choice, opening up a multi-front war, which also makes me scratch my head. I have so much to say about this, Rob, but first I wanted to get your take. What did you think of this? Yeah, it's so crazy. Like, this is the reaction I'm getting anytime I try to talk to somebody about this. It's like, you don't know what to say. So,
I just want to hear what you put on the knowledge platform was you thought there were major implications for supply chains, and I thought that was interesting. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that, aside from the other thoughts you have. So
well, so there's a couple different things here, and my key takeaway is, often when I'm on this podcast and in my work in general, I feel a lot of what I'm doing is taking the temperature down. Like, okay, this is too dramatic. This, World War III is not happening. China's not invading. Like, I'm always saying that, this is not a big story. This is a huge. It feels to me like an absolutely huge story, and that you can't make a big enough deal out of it for a couple of different reasons. The first is, let's put aside the walkie-talkies and everything else that happened yesterday, because I have no clue how to explain that. Let's go to just the beepers itself. Um, I mean, think of how many things that we use on a daily basis are assembled in one place, have components from all different sorts of places, are crossing national borders to get assembled, crossing national borders to get to wherever they're bought, that you're using, and things like that. What is to stop a nefarious country or actor from getting some of those shipments and putting something dangerous in those things, now that this precedence has been established? I mean, imagine for a moment, you're at war with another country, and you decide to get a shipment of wheat, and you decide to lace it with poison because you want that particular population to suffer if it imports that wheat. I know that I'm taking things a little bit farther, but it's not that big a jump. If we're taking shipments of beepers in and putting explosive material in them, well, why can't we take shipments of food and put poison in them? To get to your points about biologics, what is to stop a government or an actor from designing a virus or a disease to target a particular person or a particular family or a particular ethnic group, and to get it somehow on a shipment of something innocuous, and to introduce it into a population in furtherance of assassinating someone, or of taking out a ruling family, or of taking out an ethnic group? All of these sorts of things, like, they may sound crazy, and maybe I'm being way too dystopian here, but it seems to me that is the door that this opens. That trade, I mean, obviously there's always been smuggling and drugs and migrants when it comes to trade, but that in general, the world is amazing because you can trust that the computer that you bought, that was designed in California, that was assembled in China with chips that were made in this place, there's no nefarious thing there. It's not going to blow up in your face because somebody has a political axe to grind against you, or because somebody is at war with your country. And Israel just said, okay, like, it's all fair game. We can go after anything and anyone in the supply chain. So if I'm a supply chain risk professional now, and I'm worried about my own supply chain and whether something could get inserted into my supply chain, do I now have to go and I'm worried about intelligence agencies boarding ships and putting explosive material into my devices, or I'm worried about somebody taking the grain that I put on this ship and putting things into it that are going to further their national security aims. That's what terrifies me so much, because it seems to me that we haven't quite seen something like this before. The second and sort of broader points here go back to Israeli strategy, and I continue to be mystified at what Israel is doing, because they've opened up, from my point of view, this Pandora's box, and they've opened it up for what? I mean, if this is the lead up to a broader operation in southern Lebanon, and we're just seeing the very tip of the spear, and there's going to be all sorts of other operations like this, in addition to conventional military means to try and wipe out Hezbollah, okay, like I can at least see what the logic there is. But Israeli officials are saying they want to deter Hezbollah. They want Hezbollah to be so afraid that they're not going to back Hamas, that they're not going to back the Palestinian cause, and that they're going to stop bombing northern Israel so that the residents can go back. That strikes me as absolutely demented. All you did was make Hezbollah that much more committed to the cause of fighting against you. And maybe you scored a temporary blow because a lot of their best fighters and officials are going to be taken offline because they're in hospitals or having surgery because their fingers got blown off or something like that. But there's no way that this is going to deter them in general. So there's a broader point about that. But it's that dystopian point that I can't shake, that it feels like we're in a different world, because if Israel can do this to shipments of beepers that are going to Hezbollah, why can't they do some of the other things that I just talked about? Tell me if I'm crazy, because I told this to one friend yesterday, and he said, I don't see it. There's such a difference between what you're talking about and between this beeper thing. But to me, they're basically the same thing.
I wouldn't say that there's necessarily a difference, but I would frame it in a different way and ask you a question, because I think you have to consider it from the point of view of a well resourced, sophisticated state like Israel. Like, if you read the stories about this, people were in shock that they were technically able to pull this off. And there was some laudatory pieces about the special service group within the Israeli Defense Forces that does this sort of thing, and how it's this very entrepreneurial outfit. They almost made it seem like it was, early HP, but for war. Like, they're just always coming up with new ideas, and they're so creative, and that's a far cry from a crazy actor. And what I mean is, like, um, how do I frame this? One of the key things that we always need to think about is, just from an economic standpoint, the falling cost of death and destruction. So think of nuclear weapons as an example. Nuclear weapons are just going to get cheaper and easier to make and to deploy. And at some point, they'll get cheap enough that crazy people who aren't well organized and aren't states will be able to acquire them. And if we don't have, the proper defense mechanisms against them, then you could have, someone, the same way someone decides, oh, I'm going to go shoot President Trump, some cuckoo person is going to try to acquire a nuclear bomb and blow up a city with it. That is one thing. And then on the other hand, you have a well resourced, sophisticated state doing this kind of thing. Like, I can see your point if you're talking about essentially terrorist groups or non state actors or small scale, just crazy people who could, just like the divers in the North Sea, or the Baltic Sea, I should say. Same mistake you made the other day. Um,
Scotland
yeah,
forever. Scotland is going to be
damn.
taking over everything.
You see how you messed me up. Uh, just like those guys were able to take out a pipeline, because the cost of doing so was not prohibitive. Um, is the cost of intercepting a shipment of wheat and lacing it with poison, is that sufficiently low that you can have crazy people doing that sort of thing? Because that's a cost and economic question. When you're talking about states, like, I assume they could already do that. Like, any well-resourced state could do what you're describing at any time. And it's sort of like how Matthew Pines has talked about on the podcast very interestingly in the past, sort of the unspoken rules around cyber warfare and destroying critical infrastructure and water systems and electric systems and stuff like that. How there's sort of rules of engagement that states tend to follow? Like, is that what's stopping these scenarios that you're describing from happening? Or are we in a scenario now where uh, you can have small scale outfits do this sort of stuff because the technology is there, the trade choke points are there where you can get hold of a shipment of something because supply chains are so optimized and do something with it. Do you understand what I'm getting at?
I do, and it's not just Matthew Pines. Matt McClintock, who's been on the podcast a couple times, recommended the book "The Coming Wave" by Microsoft AI CEO Mustafa Suleyman to us. And the most chilling chapter in that sort of dystopian book was about, to your point, the cost and the difficulty of genetic splicing technology going down, so that you really could imagine somebody in their basement or in their garage fooling around and creating some kind of disease or some kind of virus that could kill a lot of people, and it wouldn't be that hard. What used to be in the hands of extremely advanced, you need all the sophisticated technology. You don't need those things anymore. But no, I hear what you're saying, and that's exactly my point. Because the country, or the actor that did this act did it to the terrorist group. They did it to, like, Hezbollah. I would have expected Hezbollah to be the ones that would have been willing to do something like that, because asymmetrically they needed to do it to fight against a stronger power. But this is a state like Israel that is saying, no, we are going to do this. And maybe they're telling themselves, oh, we're going to do it against a stateless actor. Maybe it was super elegant that they could get beepers that were designed in Taiwan, because not that many countries recognize Taiwan in the first place anyway. If I was Hungary, I'd be pretty mad right now that, a company that's in Budapest is in the news for this sort of thing. So maybe they thought they could get cute around that. But yes, it feels to me like a taboo has been broken. And I feel that on two ways. The first is, so if you're in so great that Startup Nation has this little outfit that has decided to do this in the context of uh, the war with Hezbollah. And by the way, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit here. Can't you just listen to these people all the time? Wouldn't it be more valuable to listen to all of their conversations rather than blow holes in their thighs and in their hands? I don't know, because if you can put in the explosive devices, I don't know if you can listen or not. We're talking about things that we don't really know. But okay, so they've taken the step. It was tactically and operationally brilliant. Is Israel ready to make sure that every single device that an Israeli civilian is using is now made with only Israeli technology? Are they ready to defend their supply chains from all the Iranian and other intelligence agencies that are going to try and replicate this against them? Is this really such a thing that Israel has some capability that everybody else doesn't have? Because if I was in Iran and I didn't have this on the whiteboard already, now it's going to be, okay, how do we do this back to them? How do we figure out how to do this back to them? And Israel's not going to have its own supply chains when it comes to these things. And yeah, the second broader point. So I mean, that's the Israel specific point, and then the broader point is, if you are one of these great nations, has a taboo been broken? Are you going to see, a country when it gets its back against a wall? Let's say that let's do a hypothetical. Let's say that Trump is elected a second time. Let's say he decides the 60% tariffs on China are not enough. Let's say it needs to be 120% tariffs, and he's also going to blockade the South China Sea with the US Navy. He's not going to do that, but let's, for the sake of the argument, let's just say that he blockades the South China Sea, 120% tariffs until China comes to the table and does whatever he wants them to do from a trade perspective. At that point, does China flip the switch? And does it say, okay, we have all of these things in different areas. We are going to try and asymmetrically respond in a way that will push back the United States against us. And I say this because it goes back to what we were talking about with Huawei. The reason that people were so afraid about Huawei was because there was going to be Chinese-made Huawei kit in all of the telecoms networks that had Huawei gear. And people were mostly worried that China was going to use this for spying or for influence over different countries. But what if they were going to use it for actual physical means? I was talking to a farmer yesterday about this question. What about all the drones that farmers are using to fertilize their fields or monitor what's going on in the fields? Are those, or just imagine like the drones that I see at Audubon Park here in New Orleans that people are flying around in the evenings for because they have no real hobbies. Like, what if those drones are going to start blowing up because the United States is at war, picks a fight with some other country? Like that's the place that it takes me to, that I'm nervous about.
So basically, you're saying it's not an example of technological capability changing. It's an example of norms being broken. Is that is that fair to say? And yeah.
Well, yeah, and I would invite listeners to respond to this, but I'll ask it to you too. Can you think of anything like this in the last 100 years or ever? Can you think of an analogous case of where a country did something like this to another actor, state actor or non-state actor? I can't. I really can't come up with a metaphor or an analogy or a similar thing. And we've talked on the podcast a lot about deglobalization, and when you were talking about the BIOSECURE Act, I forgot to mention, the person who coined this health sovereignty concept was Emmanuel Macron over there in France. He's been talking about this since the day he got into office, about how France needs to make all of its own medicines and needs all of its supply chains to be completely independent in this regard. He doesn't trust even countries like India. He wants to make these things, he wants to have control over them. I mean, how far does that have to go now? I got to the point where I don't even want to carry my cell phone in my pocket right now. I sort of always knew that, when I turn on Instagram and there's an ad for the thing that I mentioned offhand to my wife the day before, okay, so like that's creepy. But now this thing can get blown up. If you have any sort of profile at all, or if you have enemies at all, like why would you even risk having sort of these devices around? Like it really maybe that's paranoid, but like I could not stop but going to that level. And yeah, exactly right, that it goes to the breakdown of norms, where it used to be that trade was, I don't want to say unmolested, but you know trade was respected in some meaningful way. The legitimacy, the safety of products, like it's pretty amazing when you think about how global supply chains work right now. And man, if you're planning for risk, and this is now one of the risks you have to plan for, I don't know how you plan for this besides you control every single step of your supply chain, and that's just not possible unless you want to spend many trillions of dollars to do that.
I don't know. I don't really. I'm only 80% convinced by what you're saying.
Oh, 80 is further than I thought I would get. I mean, I confess, like I will tell you right now, I feel a little bit paranoid about this. I think I'm reducto ad absurding the argument, like I'm taking it to its furthest extreme. The key point, or that there's again, just to close it off, because I don't want to get too bogged down in my own crazy paranoid thoughts. The 2 points that I want to make are: I do think that this violates a norm around global trade and global supply chains. And now that that norm is violated, it feels to me like we're going to see more examples of this in the future, and that if and when there is kinetic conflict between nations, we might see more use of this just because it's on the table now. And number two, tactical operational brilliance from Israel, but strategically, where is this going? Because the country this is going to get used against first is going to be Israel, because they were the first to go at it. They're opening a second front in a war with a military industrial complex that is not built for that sort of thing. I just don't really see the logic going forward there. Okay, that's enough dystopianism, I think, for one episode. There's one more thing I wanted to make sure to hit this week, Rob, and we could have hit a lot of other things. We could have hit this massive Ukrainian strike on a Russian ammunition weapons facility. I don't know if you saw this. The explosion was so big that it like created a small earthquake. There's all sorts of things going on. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time on Mexico's judicial overhaul. And this is interesting to us for several reasons. We have clients in Mexico that we're interested in helping and thinking about these things. We are bullish on Mexico in the long run. Like this crosses a lot of T's for us and dots a lot of I's. What happened is that so AMLO has been pushing to try and reform Mexico's judiciary for literally his entire presidency. And what passed was his so-called Plan C reforms. And they're called Plan C because Plan A and B already failed. He tried to get through Plan A and Plan B, and he couldn't get them through. So he tried one more time with Plan C. And the first thing to say here is that it worked because a supermajority voted for it. So even though Morena does not technically on paper have a supermajority, they were able to get enough other votes from folks who are in technically opposition parties to get this through. So Shane Baum, his successor, who's going to be coming into office very soon, may well be working with a supermajority, at least as it comes to some of these bigger issues. I confess that on the surface of it, the judicial reform itself, at least the top line description, I was a little confused at why it was such a big deal. Because basically, what's happening is that Mexico is moving from uh, the selection of judges by elected officials to the popular election of judges. I was reading a paper from a Stanford law report here, and it talked about the only two countries in the world, I think, that it talked about having popular selection of judges in this way were Bolivia and the United States, or at least those were the ones that they wanted to single out in their paper. And I thought that was interesting because the United States is going after these judicial reforms like it's the end of Mexican democracy. The U.S. ambassador to Mexico said that this posed a risk in the commercial relationship between Mexico and the United States. He said democracies can't function without strong, independent, non-corrupt judicial branches, and sort of called into question whether Mexico's reforms have these safeguards and is not just subjecting Mexico's judicial process to popular politics. Now, again, on the surface of it, what's the big deal? So people get to select judges rather than judges being selected by politicians? Like, I could sort of make the argument either way there. This actually feels more democratic. When you get into some of the details of the laws, though, you can see why people are so concerned about this, because it's not exactly that it's just, oh, anybody can run for a judicial position and they get voted from a popular perspective and they can get in, although that poses its own problems too. It turns out that now all of the different branches of the Mexican government have to come together to select potential candidates. Those candidates are whittled down by a process and then put to the people to elect directly. The point being, if you control all of the different levers of the Mexican government, you have a disproportionate amount of power of who the candidates are going to be. And then those candidates get elected by people in general. So that's one of the problems. There are other problems in here too. So, for instance, and they're sort of, these are brilliant things from a populist perspective. Like AMLO wanted to limit the compensation for judges so that it can't be more than the president of Mexico, him or herself. Okay, on paper, sounds good. Like, public officials not making more money, judges not being paid off, and things like that. But that now means the president of Mexico can maybe set the salary of judges. The president of Mexico can, work with the Mexican government to say, okay, my salary will be reduced by 50% because I'm mad with the judges. And now the judges will get 50% less money unless they do the things that I want to do. So when you start peeling back the onion here, you can see the ways in which this might be problematic. Um, the last sort of way it's problematic is if you're in a society, and I'm not picking on Mexico here. I think most societies are more corrupt than they are willing to admit, the United States included. But if you're in a society that is particularly corrupt, where the informal economy plays a particularly large role in the economy in general, where you have extra legal groups like drug cartels out there that are really, really in control in some parts of the territory, what is to stop them from using their influence to get on the ballot themselves and to become judges and to eat the system from the inside? And that's so in that, if you go down that sort of scenario. So there are some real things to worry about here from the perspective of Mexican democracy. I think it's I think it's very rich for the United States and for the U.S. ambassador to say this risks the commercial relationship with Mexico, and this is terrible and undemocratic. Like, we literally elect judges in this country too. So I wish the United States would sort of pull it in a little bit. Um, how do you react to this, Rob? Does this make you feel worse about Mexico? Is it like this is just a nerdy topic and it's probably the same? Does it make you feel better? How do you want to react to this?
I wouldn't say better or worse in general. It depends on for whom, because one of the theses we've been talking about is this notion that Morena is sort of the reincarnation of the PRI, in the sense of, and certainly they seem to want to be that way. They want to dominate, and the way he talks, as you pointed out, it's the fourth transformation of society, and using these very highfalutin sort of historical terms to describe his movement. Um, I think this really supports that thesis. And what I mean by that, for people who aren't as familiar, is just this notion that for a very long time, Mexico was ruled by the PRI in a way that was not democratic, in a way that was essentially a one-party state, where they, upheld the forms of democracy, but really the PRI controlled who became elected, both on the judicial front and on the legislative front. Um, and that power was rooted in the perceived legitimacy of the party coming out of the Mexican Revolution. They were viewed as, like, they were literally the party of the revolution. They were the People's Party, and people, even if they had the power to really resist, which they really did not at some point in the early years, especially, that was a great source of legitimacy, right? And I think he's trying to recreate that. I think he's trying to put in place a system that's self-perpetuating in some ways. Because once you control the government, you control the confiscation and redistribution of wealth and assets and incomes and political favors and that's Mexico has a long history of that. So is he trying to recreate this? It seems like it might be the case. And for that reason, I think it's much more, this isn't just some economist article about, oh, they're doing this reform in Mexico about the judges that you just kind of skip through and whatever. Like, I think it really does point to a bigger thing in Mexico that, if we're right, that this is happening, has huge implications. Because in the past, whenever you've had this sort of thing, that legitimacy has been based on redistribution of goods to your supporters. And that's how you keep the flywheel flying. And in Mexico, that's always been around seizing land. Cardenas in the 1930s. That was always the story. Breaking up the haciendas, seizing land, redistributing, buying political support, buying favors. Um, Local politics in Mexico is extremely corrupt and doesn't function well. National politics works pretty well, is my understanding of the evaluation, where um, you have small scale local and even state level government that is much more easily bought already. This certainly is not going to help that. As you point out, in a lot of these places, essentially the government is the local cartel that controls everything. I don't think on the ground that's going to change too much in terms of who dictates who becomes the judges, but by sort of synchronizing it with the election cycle, they just make it more obvious that this is going to be part of that electoral machine, just like everything else. The judges' terms went from, I think, 9 years to 6 years, things like that. It's become another elected position. And yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, I would be very cautious if you are someone who has a stake in the existing or old system in Mexico. I think you shouldn't be encouraged by this development because it doesn't presage good things in the future. I don't think the judicial thing itself is so critical for you, but what it tells you about where things are going should cause you to stand up and take notice for sure.
It goes back to the breaking of norms and taboos that we were actually just talking about in the context of Hezbollah, because there is not that much different in what AMLO has pushed for and what Sheinbaum has supported herself, and what, say, Roosevelt tried to do with court packing in the 1930s. A very similar sort of thing, where a government was faced with national crisis, was faced with a judiciary that it felt like was not responsive or was holding up the major reforms that needed to be passed in order to get through the national crisis. So, try to democratically, with a sleight of hand, make the judiciary allow you to push these things through, or at least exert more control over the judiciary from that sense. It's why I'm going to do two things here. This reflexive U.S. criticism of this, the throwing rocks in glass houses, I have no time for. I don't really understand why this is becoming an ideological problem. There are much bigger ideological and geopolitical problems that the U.S. and Mexico are already going to have, let alone sort of critiquing their own um, judicial reforms that, we can like them or not, we can say that they're going to open up the door to more Mexican single state authoritarianism. But okay, like, a democratic vote brought this government to power, and the democratic government is doing these things. That has to mean something in general. Um, but I think I want to go back to that thing about norms, because it breaks the norm that the judiciary is supposed to stop the government here. I think that's the big thing. When the founders were thinking about different, um, you know, branches of government in the United States blocking one from the other, they didn't want the government to be able to do everything that it wanted to do. And AMLO wants to do everything. And Sheinbaum wants to do everything. They want to transform everything. And they had to get some control over the judiciary to do that. The bright side of that, the silver lining of that, if you want to take the optimistic view, is Mexico needs change. Mexico really one of the countries I think that suffered the most from globalization in terms of the exacerbation of inequality. It got a lot of wealth in a very short amount of time that was not equitably distributed. Around that time, gets all the drug cartels wars happening, which the United States is also involved in. Like Mexico has some pretty major reforms that it needs to push through. And you can see that if a government has a supermajority and it's getting dinged for what it feels like are bureaucratic or silly things around the edges, that it wants to push things forward. And maybe if you could get some of those reforms, you could get a real change in Mexican democracy or in safety and security or in corruption. The flip side of that is, and this is, I think, what critics of these reforms are worried about. Okay, what happens when the party that is pushing these things does not have noble intentions? Or what if you think Morena does not have noble intentions? What if there is something else going on here? What if the government is captured by cartels? What if Baum is just a puppet for AMLO, and AMLO is really this dictator who wants to dictate things from wherever his hacienda is down in the south, because he's the next you know uh, uh, dictator of Mexico. And I'm sympathetic to that sort of thing. But I will say that it feels to me like Mexico is at a critical moment, that the Mexican government needs power and the ability to push through some reforms. And if there's a silver lining here, it's maybe you can say that there is something connected to that. And that maybe if you can get like a lot of the things on the face, like reducing the term limits of judges, like tying the salaries of judges to other political officials, requiring that there is some kind of democratic legitimacy that goes into the judges that are chosen. On the face of it, those are not bad things. The thing I think that people are afraid of is, okay, once you have done this, what happens when there is a nefarious actor that is pulling the strings in the legislative and executive branches? I don't think Claudia Sheinbaum is that person, but it's not a far stretch to imagine that somebody could come in and replace her that would use this system in a way that would not be conducive to Mexico going forward. The last thing I'll just say on here is that, and you're exactly right to bring up the PRI and the single party dictatorship that it authored for most of the 20th century. Mexican democracy is incredibly young on a relative basis. We're talking about a democracy that is maybe 20, 25 years old. So it would be strange if Mexican democracy was perfect. Go back and look at U.S. democracy 20 to 25 years in the Republic. Go to the Civil War in 1865. It took the United States a long time to quote unquote perfect democracy. And newsflash, we haven't perfected it. We also have tons of problems. So there is also something here about the organic development of a democracy and of a country having to find its own way. And that I'm not sure it is productive to say, oh, the sky is falling just because they made some reforms when it came to the judiciary. Yes, there are problems here, and yes, there are challenges, but it's also a sign of a dynamic democracy that it is at least trying to make changes on something that everybody agrees is a problem. One of the things that I was struck by, all the NGOs, all the reports, all the critics, all the lawyers, the first thing that they'll say in the paragraph is, we agree that Mexico's judiciary is corrupt, that there are problems here, that there needs to be reforms. We just think that these reforms are really bad. And on that, like, very, very small level, I have some sympathy for a Mexican government that is saying, oh my God, we have to try something, because everything we were doing was getting bottled up because we couldn't get things pushed through. So you can feel I'm really straining there for the silver lining, because my instinct is to say, yeah, this is pretty nuts, but I'm trying to find the silver lining.
No, well, the silver lining or the optimistic view is that democracy will work as intended, mostly in Mexico. And if Morena fucks up, then they will lose their supermajority, and the landscape will normalize. That's the positive scenario. The negative scenario is if you start to see them putting in place sort of self-reinforcing mechanisms to ensure their continued control. And historically, I mean, you could just look at Mexico. That means controlling who gets what handouts and what goodies, and buying their votes at the local level, and buying the influence of important people, at the regional and state level. And then you never, miraculously, Moreno will do incredibly well at the next election, even if the economy sucks. Like, that's the scenario where I think we can pretty much say, like, okay, this is a big change. This is the PRI handbook. Um, so yeah, from an outsider's perspective, there are pros and cons. The pros are, as you say, like a one-party dictatorship gets things done. They invest, they build stuff. In part because building stuff is a way to give handouts away to their supporters, right? So to the extent that Mexico needs that, that has positive aspects. But at the same time, you know, inevitably, like by all accounts, AMLO is a pretty straight shooter, and he's like one of these traditional Mexican figures that's actually like super pure and ideological, and he's like the leader of the people. And inevitably, like it has happened over and over again, like he's going to start this movement, and then it'll be taken over by people who are unscrupulous and terrible and crooked and cloak themselves in the righteousness of, like Scheinbaum, the quote that you pasted from the end of that announcement that they did right before the grito, where she said something like, with the people everything, without the people nothing. Like that that is that's over the top, man.
It this is going to get very niche here. That quote actually reminded me of a speech that a French official gave around the French Revolution. They were talking about the status of Jews in France, and it's a very famous quote if you're if you're up on your Jewish history. But he said, "We must refuse everything to the Jews as a nation and accord them everything as individuals." Not quite the same concept that Sheinbaum was talking about, but I take your point on it being over the top. The point of that quote, by the way, being that Jews had to sublimate all of their personal identity and had to become true Frenchmen, which is a concept and a problem that still besets France today with all of its Muslim migrants and migration in general. So anyway, I don't know how we ended on that. That's an hour, and I think we hit some big stuff. Anything else you want to say, Rob? Anything else we missed? Because it's a crazy week.
No, we could stay here all day, but we got stuff to do. So
All right,
until next
sounds
week.
good. Until next time, we'll talk to you later. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.